Hi, this is Garry Maddox from the Sydney Morning Herald. Welcome to the 67th Sydney Film Festival, the virtual edition. Today we've got a discussion of Women of Steel, the documentary, and we've got with us Robynne Murphy, who's the director and also one of the interview subjects of the film, and Martha Ansara, who's the producer. So welcome both.
Thank you, Gary.
Congratulations on the film.
Actually, Gary, I should say that Robynne is also the producer. I'm just the sort of helper.
Helper, okay.
He's the producer.
Okay. I guess one of the interesting things, Robynne, about this film is your journey to becoming a filmmaker. It sounds like you had very early ambitions, but it's taken a while. So can you tell us about that?
Well, I think I started my film career with Sydney Filmmakers Co-op way back in the early 70s and got quite enthusiastic, made a few films. Then I went to what was the Film and Television School before it became AFTRS. Did some work for the ABC and tried to get grants for documentaries. And I got quite active in social justice campaigns, and the filming and the hard work of trying to raise money for making films went to one side and I just went to the other side. So I got involved in a campaign around women's rights in the workforce, and that really just took up all of my time for about over 30 years. That's 40 years ago. And then I left the Steelworks finally, and I had to leave the Steelworks to make this film. I couldn't have made it when I was working rotating shifts. And so that was the beginning of making Women of Steel.
So tell us about when you got involved in the Filmmakers Co-op and the film school. You must have been very political and you had ambitions to make films with a sort of social justice message.
Yes, absolutely. I was around a group called Resistance, which was a radical youth organisation, a socialist organisation, anti-war organisation, and also a great organisation for initiating women's liberation and women's rights. So, and then I met Martha at that time, like 100 years ago, it seems like, and I went to a workshop that Chris Tillam ran on, and I made a film out of that called Woman's Day 20 Cents, which was about a friend of mine who'd broken up with a husband, and really sort of it focused on, at that time, the way that doctors treated women in that situation was have another Valium. So it was all about how women really need to stand up independently. And so that was the first film. And then I went to the Film and Television School after that.
Was that the first year of the Film and TV School?
Yes, the first intake with Gillian Armstrong, Phil Noyes, Chris Noonan, Graham Shirley. So I have made contact with quite a few of them since then. But yes, I've been down another path, making steel basically.
Okay. So what job were you doing at the Steelworks?
Oh, well, I started off as a welder, a second-class welder, not a first-class welder, a second-class welder, which I thought was hilarious because women have always been seen as being second-class citizens. And then I got retrenched, and it was during that period that I started to realise we had to make a film. I had to make a film about what was happening with women in the steelworks. So I did crane driving, crane chasing, welding. I was an operator in the hot strip mill. So I was a grease monkey. I did probably about a dozen different jobs over a period of 30 years.
So it is an interesting transition from wannabe filmmaker and, in fact, filmmaker, from what you say from that first film, to going to the Steelworks. What was the kind of progression that took you not just out of Sydney, but into a field like that?
It was mainly my passion around politics and women's rights. That took me to Wollongong because I was involved in an organisation that really wanted to make a difference for working women. I had been involved in the women's liberation movement, and there was a focus on trying to take the women's liberation movement into the more complicated workforce, because in Wollongong, over 50% of the population came from different countries. So it was a multilingual workforce. Women were desperate for work. And as I became involved in the Steelworks and I realised just how bad things were, that just drew me closer to wanting to make the film.
So you felt like that rather than just being a union activist or somebody on the outside organising, you had to actually get a job there.
Yes, I was campaigning for the right for women to work in the Steelworks, so it made sense not to be on the sidelines, but to be in the thick of it. And I think that experience has been absolutely fantastic. I really grown to respect the various migrant communities in the area and the union movement and how to organise, and which is actually I've taken a lot of these skills through to making this film. As you know, I mean, filmmaking's you've got to be at it all the time. You have to be organised, and I think all of those accumulation of skills have made it possible for me to make this second film.
You've got to weld the bits together.
Yeah, true. Yeah.
Did you have any welding skills before you got the job there, or did you learn on the job?
That's an interesting story. When I was in Sydney, I got a job at GMH, and it was before they closed down Pagewood, and the job was electric welding. And I lasted in that job for 6 weeks. I got the sack for union activity. And when I applied at the Steelworks, I didn't tell them anything about the welding experience because I knew if they contacted GMH and they said I'd been sacked for union activity, I'd never get a job in the Steelworks.
Okay. So we get a sense of how important the Steelworks was for Wollongong. It was the big employer and it was almost the dominant force in Wollongong. What was it like when you started work there? Tell us a bit about the feel of it, the kind of scale of it, the atmosphere.
Well, there were over 20,000 people working in the Steelworks when we were initially campaigning for work and when we got jobs in 1980. It was black, it was dirty. Other friends have described it as Darth Vader, that it was huge, it was noisy. It was well alight at night. There were flames coming out everywhere. Martha refers to the eternal flame that she sees from her house in Port Kembla. But it was a hub of multicultural activity. It was dangerous. All of these things together. And look, I felt like I took to it like a duck to water. I loved it all. I loved communicating with people. That's my passion, is communication. So, like even not knowing the language, often you'd be down on the shop floor and there'd be a crane above you and you had to communicate some way. No mobile phones, no radios, nothing like that. So you do hand signals, like, if you wanted to go to the toilet or, if you were hungry. And so, it was inventive as well. So, a great atmosphere. I miss it. I still miss it now.
I had some time as a young journalist at the Mercury, and I remember the peak hour in Wollongong was when the shift changes. You had sort of like 10 minutes of cars going in and out, and that was your peak hour.
That's
the
right.
Steelworks was everything in town, yeah. Maybe, Martha, I'll ask you some questions here. What was Robynne like in those days, and were you surprised that she went to the Steelworks instead of filmmaking?
Nothing Robynne does would surprise me. Look, she belonged to that group she mentioned, and I loathed them. But she herself was the most open, non-sectarian person, which meant that when I found out she was making the film and when they asked me to come and have a look, which sucked me in, I knew that it wouldn't be doctrinaire, it wouldn't be attract, which I hate political films that attracts. So she was always, and hard-working, oh my God. So she was always like that, just a great work ethic and a great spirit, you know, very generous and open.
Okay.
So I thought, wow.
Yeah. Robyn, do you, the film's been obviously an ambition for a lot of years for you to make it. What was the trigger to actually say, well, now I have to do it?
That's a good question. I mean, it had been buzzing around in my mind for the whole time at the Steelworks. And I retired from the Steelworks. I also met my partner just before I retired. And we moved down to the South Coast, but I got involved in bush care and a few things along the coast, as you do. And I found there was just so much activity going on. I couldn't start the film properly. And then we moved to Nelligan, which is where I live now, quiet and peaceful. And it was the right place and the right time to do it. But I had started making the film in Wollongong when I was still living there. And it was difficult because finding the right mix of people to make the film is so critical. Having the right production crew, that all evolved, I suppose, over a few years. It took me a few years to actually find those people and to find Martha again. I mean, we hadn't seen each other for quite a year. Martha, and as a friend, you really need to make something that you think is something that everybody wants to watch, which I hope is what the film is.
Yeah, it's a historical document in lots of ways, isn't it? And it tells us not only about Australian society at the time, but it tells us a lot about the early sort of feminist movement. What was it? I mean, there is reference in the film to the fact that women had to go and get their husband's approval to get a bank loan and things of that kind. I guess it's probably hard for people today, especially young women, probably to think about the difficulties, the challenges for women in those days.
Yes, absolutely, which is why it was important to use particularly some of that earlier archival footage and to explain just exactly how bad things were for women. And I mean, I think things have changed, obviously, for the better, and we've won some victories, but I think there's still a way to go. I think the cultural attitude towards women is still one that needs to be improved. And but the stuff that was happening in the 70s and leading, and don't forget Wollongong was a little bit detached from Sydney. I mean, it's not so much that now, but I always found you were stepping back in time a few years when I went to Wollongong initially. So some of the attitudes were probably not even as progressive as those in Sydney in the early 80s.
It's interesting, we see a woman there who says, and she doesn't even realise this is offensive, she says, look at their faces are all the same. And I guess that says a lot about kind of Anglo attitudes to immigrants and multiculturalism at the time. There are still issues, but it was a very different society then.
Yes, and I'm glad you picked that up. That was actually in 1993, that footage. So even then, we see quite clear racism and sexism. So it's it's an important part of the film as well. Yeah.
There's a mention of writing to Bruce Springsteen. Did Bruce Springsteen ever write back?
Well, Louise, who spoke about that, said he didn't write back, as far as I know, because Louise would have probably told me, but his assistant or whoever it was said, asked, well, what do you want us to do? And I think Louise was so gobsmacked that she just went, just support us. So I think, that was great though, eh?
Yeah. When did you leave the Steelworks?
2000 and I've got to think about it now. 2009.
What was it like then for women and for migrant communities? How much had it changed?
Well, BHP was the company that I worked for initially, but it evolved to BHP Steel, BHP Billiton, and now we've got a separate company, BlueScope Steel, that still has some connections with BHP. And I think that the company you see now has certainly learnt a lot from what happened with our case, because at that time it was quite it attracted a lot of media, as the film shows. And I think that BlueScope Steel's committed to trying to employ as many women as they can. But the nature of the steelworks has changed a fair bit. Everything's been computerised. There's not the same manual labour work that there was 40 years ago. And so migrant women in particular have even a smaller chance of getting work at BlueScope Steel, unless they've been educated over the generations, because there's probably a couple of generations since then. But you do see a lot of women engineers and women in, supervising roles. So it's quite refreshing to see that.
Martha, from your perspective as an outsider, how significant was this campaign and the victory?
Oh, well, that's one of the reasons why I got involved. It actually changed the law, it changed the thinking, it changed so much. And particularly in Wollongong, where women couldn't get jobs, or they got, as you'll see in the film, terrible jobs, it was really significant. I mean, people worked there because they really wanted the job and the money. I'm sure, I know Robyn did too. But yes, it made a huge impact. And in fact, it's written up by people who specialise in anti-discrimination, but that doesn't go very far. Whereas this film, which is a great story, I hope will reach people. And the significance of it for me was also that although it's not explicit in the film, it's a great lesson for how to get somewhere with a campaign, which is a bit different from what people are doing now. I think, if you looked at the film closely, you'd understand why it worked.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Robyn, it was very much a kind of a direct action campaign, I suppose. A tent embassy, marching in the streets, taking the issue very much to the company. Would you approach it differently nowadays in a similar kind of campaign?
I don't think so. I think, like when people do come together, and this is one of the huge challenges we've got right at the moment, but when people do come together and share experiences and do things together, I think it does make a difference. And I think that definitely you need to have as many strategies as possible in a campaign. And I think the other reason for the film is that we do actually point out all the different strategies that we used, which included meetings, discussions, film nights, fundraisers, and the court case. I mean, the laws had only been in existence for about 4 or 5 years when we actually started using them properly to highlight the discrimination. But I think that if people want change, they need to use anything at their fingertips, anything they can to organise and to do things together. It's really difficult also. I think the other aspect of this campaign, and maybe we didn't point it out so much in the film, was that there'd been one major anti-discrimination case prior to our campaign, to the Jobs for Women campaign. It was a woman called Deborah Wardsley. She wanted to be an air pilot for Ansett Airlines, and they refused to employ her because she was a woman. She was working as an air pilot. Years later, she won her case. But in the whole number of events that happened in that period in the 70s, I mean, her personal life was hauled over the coals. And, it was up there in the media. Why isn't she at home with her children? And I think when women stick together and we look after each other, you don't get that personal individual attack that we often find that women, come under.
A couple of questions to finish off, Robyn. When you saw your colleagues from film school, the Phil Noyces and Gillian Armstrongs and Chris Noonan's going off making all these great films, and you're in the Steelworks, did you think you'd done the right thing, or did you feel like envious of what they were doing?
I was too busy having fun, I think. I was too busy enjoying, what I was doing. But, as I realised that I had to make the film towards the last few years in the Steelworks, I was starting to get very interested in what everyone was doing from the film school, yeah.
And are you back as a filmmaker now?
I don't know. I want to see the end of this and get it out there first. Let's see what happens after that. I think it's been a really long journey, and it's been hard, but it's been fun. And I'm sure there's something happening out there that might wet my whistle or might keep me going again. But I'd love to work with younger people, and that was one of the other lovely things about the film, is that we had a great community of young filmmakers from the Wollongong area involved in the film, and I'd love to see them moving up, and I'll give them as much encouragement as I can.
It's a tough business being in the film industry. Would you suggest people have welding as a backup?
Have what?
Welding as a backup career?
No. No, I don't think it's got anything to do with it, but, it's your life experiences that help you develop and put things together.
Absolutely. Yes, that's right. No, I didn't mean to put down any of those jobs in the Steelworks, all completely fascinating in their own rights. But thank you very much for joining us. Best of luck with the film. Thank you, Martha, as well, and great to see it. It's a real period of history, a real slice of history we get to see through this film, so well done.
Thank you.